During the course of a campaign, you will notice and you will be subjected to pressure from 4 different corners: your contributors, interest groups, the press, the voters. And oh, I might add, there is often a 5th player in your journey on the campaign trail: your integrity. I've often had clients who faced ethical dilemmas during their campaigns, and here is my advice. If it is illegal, it's a no-brainer. We don't do it. If it is highly unethical or something you would not want your mother or children to know you did, it's highly inadvisable. If it is a judgment call that affects your reputation for integrity, take a look in the mirror. If you can still be proud of what you see and keep your self-esteem after you've made your decision, good. If you can't, don't do it. In the end, the only thing any of us take to our grave is our reputation. As you juggle the competing and conflicting demands of contributors, interest groups, and the press, you will do well to remember that at the end of the day, it is the voters who decide elections. And while it may be necessary to bend to pressure from the press, interest groups, and contributors, if you allow any to dictate your message or your positions on issues of the day, you may find yourself crossways with the very people who determine whether you win or lose. A couple of stories, one about how contributors sank a campaign and another about how they launched a career. In 1986, my firm was involved in a campaign for governor of Alabama. Our client was a populist who felt that some of the powerful interest in the state had rigged the system in a way that was unfair to poor people. And one of the laws he wanted to change was a provision that allowed utility companies to cut off electricity to customers who were only 30 days behind on their payment. We tested the idea, found that it was popular, and produced a commercial in which our client said that utility customers should be given a 90-day grace period and a chance to make good on their overdue utility bills. We aired the spot, and within a week noticed that our client had touched a populist chord and had risen 7 points in our weekly tracking study. When I called the client to tell him how well the spot was working, he told me to take it off the air. Why, I asked. The spot was working and having its desired effect. Well, he said, that might be the case, but the utility companies don't like the spot, and they've let me know that if we don't pull the spot, that the money they promised me won't be coming my way. It's a classic example of how a political candidate bent to pressure from a well-heeled contributor and allowed it to affect his message. He lost the election. In 1986, a young man wanted to run for Secretary of State in a certain Midwestern state. During his announcement and in his stump speech, he struck a populist note and said that lobbyists in the state capitol had too much influence, passed too much money around, said they needed to be more heavily regulated, and pronounced that he was just the man to do it. This went on for a few weeks until the young candidate was paid a visit by the head of the state's lobbying organization. The lobbyist explained to the candidate that his language was not appreciated and that he needed to change his tune if he wanted some of that ample money they had to pass around. In short, he was told to find a different issue to talk about. He did. He was elected Secretary of State, went on to serve 2 terms as governor, and after that was elected to the United States Senate. What is the moral of the 2 stories I just mentioned? There isn't one, but they illustrate a point about the cross pressures of American politics. There isn't always a right or wrong answer, and the question of how you handle an ethical dilemma isn't always black and white. Very often it is a pale gray. In both cases, these candidates thought they were making a pragmatic decision for the greater good of their cause and the funding they needed to run their campaigns. Neither saw the decision they made as a crippling compromise of their integrity. You might see it differently. Certainly the voters did. For in the case of the candidate for governor of Alabama, an enterprising reporter noted that after the spots were pulled, There came a flood of contributions from the utility companies into his campaign coffers. And because the newspaper thought it was news, the newspaper gave the episode widespread coverage, and therefore the voters knew all about the decision he'd made and why. In the case of the young candidate for Secretary of State, only 3 people ever knew about the conversation, and no reporter ever noticed the subtle change in the young candidate's stump speech, one that went from cracking down on lobbyists to improving public education. Interest groups can be helpful. They can also kill you. A couple of stories, one about how an interest group destroyed a campaign, and another about how one got somebody elected to Congress. In 1982, there was a Democratic primary for governor of Arkansas. One of the candidates happened to be a congressman who desperately wanted the nomination. A congressman who approached the head of the AFL-CIO about securing an early endorsement in some sorely needed campaign cash. He was told in so many words that both would be forthcoming if he could see fit to cast a few votes in favor of some legislation the AFL-CIO dearly wanted passed in Congress. The congressman dutifully complied and was rewarded beyond his wildest dreams. With the union endorsements and the early money, he quickly became the early frontrunner for the Democratic nomination. His name was Jim Guy Tucker, and his plan would have worked well, but for the counter strategy launched by his principal opponent in that contest, a former governor named Bill Clinton, who also wanted the nomination. Seeing that he'd been had with the AFL-CIO, Clinton attacked Tucker for becoming a Washington liberal out of touch with the values of Arkansas voters, and used the votes Tucker had given to the AFL-CIO to assert that Tucker had become one of the most liberal members of Congress. The AFL-CIO endorsement and the union money became a noose around Tucker's neck in a right-to-work state. His marriage to the unions cost him the Democratic nomination. In 1994, there was a Republican primary for Congress in the state of New York. Out of 7 candidates, 6 were pro-life, all of whom sought the endorsement of pro-life organizations. The 7th candidate was ill-funded, had no organization, and ran as the only openly pro-choice candidate. She sought and received the endorsement of every pro-choice organization in the district, and was relentlessly attacked by the other 6 candidates in debates, speeches, and their advertising. What her opponents did not realize was that every time they attacked her, they became unwitting accomplices of her strategy and the author of their own demise. For every time they spoke about the issue, the more people learned that she was the only pro-choice candidate. In the process of attacking her, they helped her carry a message she did not have the money to convey herself. On primary day, the 6 pro-life candidates split the pro-life vote. The pro-choice voters had only one place to go. She won her primary and went on to serve 12 years in Congress. The moral of the story? In choosing your friends, choose them carefully and think through what you are doing. Sometimes proximity to an interest group can serve you well, as it did the woman running for Congress. It can also undermine your reputation for independence and make it appear to voters that you are a little more than an errand boy for a special interest group, as it did Jim Guy Tucker in Arkansas. The media can also make or break your campaign in ways that might surprise you, as these stories illustrate. In 1977, there was a crowded Democratic primary for mayor of New York City. Ed Koch, at the time an obscure liberal congressman from Manhattan, entered the race and, to the surprise of many, announced that he favored the death penalty and planned to make it a central issue in the campaign. The pundits ridiculed Koch. After all, New York City is a bastion of liberalism, Those who vote in Democratic primaries are even more liberal than the city as a whole. And the liberal mainstream media pounced, asserting that Koch was a pandering, opportunistic demagogue, because after all, only the legislature can pass a death penalty bill. But Koch knew exactly what he was doing. Crime was rampant, middle-class voters were afraid to walk the streets at night, and Koch, the candidate from Manhattan, needed to find a way to appeal to working-class voters in Brooklyn and Queens. By picking a fight with the sensibilities of the liberal mainstream media, Koch ensured coverage of his campaign, and every time he was attacked in the press, the more people became aware that he was the only candidate running who favored the death penalty. The press made Koch the populist in the race against a field of candidates who appeared to be limousine liberals and elites. Koch went on to serve 3 terms as mayor. In 1990, there was a Republican primary for governor of Kansas. The issue was the property tax. The incumbent, Mike Hayden, was challenged by a wealthy real estate developer from Wichita who promised to cut the property tax. Hayden had raised taxes to fund education and local government and was in deep doo-doo at the outset of the primary. Pulling a rabbit out of the hat, Hayden began visiting editorial boards to explain why taxes had increased and suggested to the editorial writers that they ask for and examine his opponent's plan to cut them. Soon editorials appeared suggesting that his opponent release his own plan to cut the property tax. And his opponent, thinking it would be a good way to curry favor with the editorial writers, promptly complied, winning praise from the newspapers for his candor and the meticulous detail of his plan. It was a fatal mistake. For while the editorial writers were impressed, the voters were not. Hayden began attacking his opponent's plan in television and radio ads, in particular his scheme to tax haircuts, school books, and prescription drugs in order to reduce property taxes. It was a masterful stroke, for in using the press as an unwitting accomplice and tricking his opponent into releasing a detailed plan, Hayden changed the subject from his pro-tax record to his opponent's ill-conceived and ill-thought plan. His opponent was on the defensive the rest of the campaign and lost a race he should have won. Had his opponent not tried to curry favor with the editorial writers by releasing a plan, Hayden would have had nothing to attack and no means of putting his opponent on the defensive. Moral of the story? Sometimes taking a beating from the press can serve your purpose. Sometimes succumbing to what the press wants you to do can bring a career to an inglorious end. These are just a few stories and real-life examples of the cross-pressures exerted by contributors, interest groups, and the press in the course of political combat. Examples of things that went wrong and cost people their careers. Examples of how candidates wedged interest groups and the press to further their cause. There are 2 principal points about the stories. First and most important, never forget that it is voters who decide elections. And as you navigate these sometimes turbulent waters of a political campaign, never forget that it is the voters who will judge you by the judgments you make. And second, never rush into a decision of how to handle the pressure of contributors, interest groups, and the press without giving thought to the implications of your decision. For if you make the wrong one, you may find that short-term gain begets a lot of long-term pain. While I cannot tell you what decisions to make or even anticipate the difficult decisions you may face, I am going to share with you now some things you should do at the outset and during the course of your campaign to ensure that you keep it on track. If you've seen my other DVDs, you'll already know how to put together an offensive strategy and how to prosecute it. This DVD is about how to help you avoid mistakes, how to anticipate the unexpected, smell a problem before it becomes a problem, and dealing with it if it does. First and foremost, anticipate and prepare. The best way to avoid detours or bumps in the road or things that can throw your campaign off course is to wargame your campaign at the outset. Pretend that you are your opponent. Plan your opponent's campaign against you. It is a great way of uncovering your own weaknesses and constructing a strategy to deal with them if your opponent exploits them. Start with your contributors. Where are you getting your money? Are any of the groups or donors you are getting it from controversial? Could anyone plausibly assert that an interest group that is funding you has or might get something of value in return? Have you ever done a favor or given a contract to an individual or a company that has or might give money to your campaign? Is there anything unusual about the timing of the donations you have received and a decision you made or a vote you cast? Could anyone make a plausible connection between your issue positions or voting record and the sources of your campaign money? If so, how are you going to deal with the accusation if it comes? Are you going to counter by attacking your opponent for his or her sources of campaign contributions? Are you prepared to defend the contracts you let, or the way you voted, or to refute the assertion that your convictions are dictated by people and interest groups that are funding you? This is not a silly exercise. It is an essential one. If you have an intelligent opponent, guaranteed they are looking at your sources of money, the date you received it, your relationship with those who gave it, and plotting a potential line of attack. If you're not ready for it, shame on you. I told you the story of how a gubernatorial candidate's proximity to a labor union sank his campaign. Are you putting yourself in a vulnerable position with the voters by accepting the support or endorsement of an interest group? Do any of your prominent supporters have the potential to embarrass you? Have you worshiped in a church with a controversial minister? Served with a disreputable person on the board of directors of a company or organization? Cavorted with any unsavory characters? Are you prepared to handle the associations you made with interest groups that have extreme or unusual positions on certain issues? And by that I mean this: the People for Pets PAC endorses you and you gladly accept the endorsement, only to learn that the People for Pets PAC also supports a new property tax on anybody who owns or buys a dog or a cat. Are you prepared to respond when your opponent asserts that you want a new tax on dog and cat owners? This exercise is not as silly as it might seem. More than once, I've seen candidates defeated with the words uttered by their prominent supporters or the platforms of interest groups that have endorsed them. Now take a look at yourself, your biography, your professional career, how you have made your money, your statements, voting record, what you have written, and ask yourself, if you were running against you, how would you attack you? Sometimes it is worth the extra money to have your Oppo research people do a vulnerability study on you as well as the opponent. If they're good at what they do, they'll likely uncover things that you thought were inconsequential, even things you have forgotten you said or have done that you had best be prepared to defend or answer for. An example, I once worked for a candidate who told me he'd never had a tax problem and had never been sued. And just to make sure, I had my Oppo research specialist do a thorough background check. And there he was, named 7 different times as a defendant in a civil liability case. He had forgotten something that had happened several years before because the cases against him were dismissed. But just because a case has been dismissed does not mean it will not be raised by an opponent during the course of a campaign. Moral of the story? You want to know your opponent better than he knows himself. You also want to make sure that you have a complete inventory of everything your opponent may find or learn about you, so that you are fully prepared in case your opponent or the media raises it during the campaign. The more time you have to prepare for an assault, the better your response and counterpunch will be. The definition of chaos in a hard-hitting campaign is when it has been blindsided by an assault it did not anticipate and had no idea was coming. Here are some real-life examples of ways to smell a problem coming and ways that we bought ourselves time to prepare. I was once involved in a Texas campaign and every morning had breakfast with a fellow who had a very special assignment. His job was to go to a certain watering hole, order a beer, and listen to what was being said. For we had learned that the strategist of our principal opponent at the end of the day would go drinking at a certain bar and talk about their strategy and what they planned to do to us. It was not a very bright thing for them to do. And because we planted some ears at the bar, we always knew what to anticipate and were fully prepared when they launched an offensive against us. In fact, we often had our response ads ready before they could get their ads on the air. In another campaign in which mail was the chief medium of communication, we were able to learn the name and the location of the printing facility our opponent was using. A printing facility that was not always careful about what they threw into the trash can at the end of the day. I assigned a young intern to monitor the trash bin at the printing facility. We always knew what was coming before it ever hit anybody's mailbox. There are other ways of learning what your opponent is about to do so that you can be prepared when it comes. Make sure you or members of your staff sign up for email updates from your opponent's campaign. Monitor the blogs. Quite often they are the first to post information that your opponent has dug up on you. And the reason they post it is to get it into the mainstream media, stories they can then cite in a mail piece, TV, or radio commercial. Needless to say, you should have your own blog that you control so that you can do the same to your opponent. When you see the opposition post something, take a hard look at their research and supporting evidence and prepare your response. Be prepared to refute their evidence and to prosecute your side of the story with reporters in a mail piece or on TV and radio just in case their attack gains some traction. Your opponent may also choose to go directly to a newspaper with research they have done on you and hope they can get a sympathetic reporter to bite on the story. My worst nightmare in any campaign is the reporter who calls at 10 till 5 in the afternoon to say they are about to run a damaging story about my client and that I have 10 minutes to come up with a response. You won't always get it, but if that happens, beg for time. Ask for a meeting. Ask to see the evidence. Ask for time to talk with the candidate and the people being mentioned in the story. Whatever you do, never say no comment. To the reader, that is an admission of guilt to the accusation being made. Finally, you may find that your opponent has chosen to surprise you not through a blog or through a journalist, but by airing a TV or a radio ad that contains a frontal assault on you or your integrity. Even in this case, there are ways to get a little advance notice. Make friends with the person at the TV or radio station who is booking your time. Pay them a visit and ask to be introduced to the people who log in new commercials as they arrive at the stations. Make a friend and treat them well. More than once, I have received a call from somebody in the back room of a TV station who has tipped me off to a new spot that the opposition has just delivered, or better yet, made a copy for me to review. In fact, I once got just a call from a TV station in Santa Barbara, California at 11 o'clock at night. Senator Pete Wilson's opponent in that race had just delivered a damning television commercial with instructions to air it starting at 7 a.m. the next morning. Thanks to the tip, we worked overnight on the response and counterpunch. We had our response up and on the air before their spot aired. If you do a good job anticipating what your opponent may do to you and use your nose to smell it coming before it happens, the less likely it is you will ever be totally surprised by an assault from your opponent or the press. Still, bad things do happen to good candidates, and it is often helpful to keep the following in mind if it does. If a law has been broken, or if you have taken more than you are allowed to from an individual or from a company that is not allowed to give to you, it is a no-brainer. Give it back and do it quickly. If you don't, a one-day story will become a 3 or 4-day story. If the story is about the criminal or unethical behavior of a person who gave to you, give it back or announce that you're going to give the money to charity or a nonprofit organization. If the accusation is made that it was paid to play money or money in return for a vote, giving it back is a tacit admission that you are guilty. And for that reason, I usually advise candidates to stand their ground and challenge the opponent to prove that something unsavory happened. If it didn't, the story and the accusation usually have a short shelf life. I don't believe campaigns should ever argue about polls. They change from day to day. They differ from one organization to the other. And citing good polls one day may be a curse on another day when they're not so good. If you are asked about polls that show you behind, simply express satisfaction about where you are and confidence that you will be where you need to be on Election Day. If you are asked about polls that show you ahead, express satisfaction about where you are, but caution that lots of things can happen between now and Election Day that affect what the polls say. If you don't handle it that way, reporters will be calling you when polls go bad, asking you why your campaign has gone into the crapper. It is often news when an interest group endorses you. It is even bigger news when one that has endorsed you withdraws their endorsement. If that happens, you want the story to go away as quickly as possible and to counterpunch on the way out. An example, I once worked for a U.S. senator whose campaign chairman was a bank president who abruptly resigned during the campaign and announced that he would support the senator's opponent. Our response? The bank president had long been upset by the senator's opposition to redlining, and while the senator was sorry to lose his support, he was going to stand on the side of the voters who had suffered discrimination at the hands of the bank. In another campaign, an environmental organization withdrew an endorsement after my client voted a certain way on a bill that was important to a labor union. We simply said that given the choice between good-paying jobs for the district and legislation that would force massive layoffs, we decided to come down on the side of working men and women. In both cases, they became one-day stories that had no lasting effect on the campaign. And in both cases, we turned lemons into lemonade with our counterpunch. Most all campaigns have cash flow problems at one time or another. First and foremost, if you are having cash problems, never stiff the grunts. If you do, it will be a story because they'll talk. Instead, ask your highly paid staff and consultants to wait a week or two for their money. When dealing with a bad story about your dearth of campaign cash, remember that most voters don't care. They're not voting for or against you based upon what you have in your campaign treasury. If you treat a cash flow problem as a crisis, the press will call it a crisis. If you treat it as an inconsequential bump in the road that will soon be rectified, the more likely it is you can steer the campaign coverage back to something that will get you votes. Much of this DVD has been about how to anticipate a problem, smell it coming, and dealing with a campaign crisis. Before we finish, it is well to remember a few other things. You can't win playing defense. You only win playing offense. A few tips about keeping your opponent at bay so that they never complete a Hail Mary pass. In the early part of a campaign, I always try to get a measure of the opposition's mettle by testing their response time or igniting a fire inside the opponent's camp. All campaigns have their weaknesses, and it is easier to exploit them if you know what they are. In some cases, it is a candidate with an explosive temper, or an opponent who's a control freak that won't allow staff to make decisions on their own, or an opponent who has too many consultants at the table and is therefore unable to respond quickly to an assault. First, know your opponent. Second, know their campaign team, his or her consultants, and who your opponent has on his staff. Know their backgrounds. Look at other campaigns they have done. Talk to people they worked against so that you know how they operate and what is in their playbook. All consultants have a playbook and a certain way of doing things. The more you know about your opponent's team, the better equipped you will be to withstand the things they may throw at you. After hearing all of this, you may be tempted to ask, is all of this really necessary? Is this kind of preparation overkill? Is it really possible to anticipate everything that someone might throw your way or to plan for every conceivable bump in the road? The answer is no. You can't anticipate everything, and I've never, in the 300+ campaigns I've done, not had at least one surprise. But I can also tell you this. Like a football team that has been carefully prepared and studied the tapes of the opposing team, you will enter the field of battle with much greater confidence, and you will play the game with far more poise if you feel prepared for every eventuality. You will also sleep better at night and endure fewer sleepless nights if you are primed and equipped to handle the roadblocks and detours inherent to political combat. I'm Jay Townsend. Thanks for listening.